Imagine for a moment that your senses could be dialed into a completely different frequency. What if you could feel the sunlight nourishing you like a tree, experience the world in a flurry of motion like a lizard darting through leaves, or truly understand the unadulterated joy in a child's laugh from the inside out?
Mm.
What if compounds, known as psychedelics, things like magic mushrooms, mescaline, LSD, ayahuasca, even MDMA, held the potential to actually rewire your mind,
Mhm.
offering you a fresh, almost childlike perspective on reality?
Yeah.
The question is, would you be willing to take that leap, even if it meant facing aspects of yourself or the world that might initially feel terrifying?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this isn't just a hypothetical scenario. We're currently witnessing what many are calling a psychedelic renaissance. Serious scientific inquiry is exploding, exploring how these compounds could fundamentally change the way we treat some of the most challenging human conditions. Depression, PTSD, substance use disorders, anxiety, and even the profound distress that can accompany end-of-life care. And beyond these therapeutic possibilities, there's also, a burgeoning interest in their potential to enhance our baseline well-being, unlock creativity, boost productivity, and foster deeper levels of personal growth.
Okay, let's unpack this. This isn't some newfangled trend, is it?
Yeah.
It feels more like modern science is finally catching up to a knowledge that humanity has held for millennia.
Absolutely.
Across cultures and throughout history, these substances, often found in nature, have been integral to sacred rituals, used as traditional medicines, and employed as tools for shifting consciousness, for expanding our understanding of the mind.
Mm.
The very word psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, has its roots in the Greek language. It was coined back in the 1950s by the British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Osmond was the one who introduced Aldous Huxley, the celebrated author of Brave New World and the Doors of Perception, to the experience of mescaline. And in a letter to Huxley, Osmond penned the now famous lines, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic."
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a remarkable thread weaving through history. It's not just confined to so-called fringe cultures. Many highly accomplished individuals in both science and the arts have reportedly explored the potential of psychedelics.
Like who?
Consider figures like Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA structure, the iconic astronomer Carl Sagan, musical legends like Paul McCartney, innovators such as Steve Jobs, the Grammy-winning artist Casey Musgraves,
Oh,
and the counterculture icon Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey himself spoke of how LSD helped them discover a new way to think by allowing the mind to engage in piecing together new thoughts.
so what does all of this tell us? In this deep dive, we're going to explore the enduring allure of these compounds for humanity. We'll delve into the latest scientific theories explaining how they interact with the brain, examine their potential benefits and the possible pitfalls, and discuss their profound impact on our consciousness, our sense of connection, and our inherent capacity for creativity.
Yeah.
Our aim is to have an informative and, we hope, entertaining conversation that might just offer you a glimpse beyond the well-known doors of perception that Huxley described.
And to guide us on this exploration, we have the privilege of speaking with three truly remarkable individuals. First, Rick Doblin, the founder and executive director of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick has been a tireless pioneer, dedicating his life to the responsible legalization of psychedelics.
Right.
And most recently, spearheading the incredibly promising Phase 3 clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Phase 3 trials, for those unfamiliar, are the final stage of testing in humans before a drug can be considered for approval by regulatory bodies like the FDA.
Okay, crucial step. Next, we welcome Reggie Watts, the internationally acclaimed musician, comedian, actor, and artist, currently serving as the band leader on CBS's The Late Late Show with James Corden. Reggie's personal encounters with psychedelics have deeply influenced his unique creative expression and his ongoing exploration of consciousness.
And finally, we have Guld Dolan, an associate professor of neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Her lab's research focuses on the fascinating world of brain plasticity and social behavior, and her team has recently made a groundbreaking discovery that MDMA has the remarkable ability to reopen a novel, critical period of brain plasticity in mice,
Wow.
a finding with significant potential implications for human therapeutics. It's truly an exciting time in what we're calling the psychedelic renaissance.
Absolutely. And as many are aware, these substances are hardly new. Historical evidence suggests that for thousands of years, indigenous cultures across the globe have utilized naturally occurring psychedelics for healing practices, sacred rituals, and perhaps as a means to connect with realms beyond our ordinary perception. Reggie, let me start with you. What do you believe drives this enduring cross-cultural use of psychedelics?
I think a big part of it is simply human nature. We're inherently curious explorers. I also think there's something about psychedelics that puts you in a state where you feel connected beyond your usual sensory inputs. There's almost a kind of cruise control element to it, meaning a substance can shift your state of consciousness, allowing for experiences that might otherwise require dedicated practices like meditation to reach.
Like a shortcut almost.
Kind of, yeah. It kind of propels you into that state or unlocks a doorway, however you want to see it. And I think that's appealing because it feels like we're accessing knowledge or experiences that lie beyond our everyday perceptions, something akin to a dream or a waking dream or something in that realm. Ultimately, it's this interconnected web of curiosity, discovery, personal experience, and ritual.
Gold, what are your thoughts on this? What do
Yeah.
you think accounts for this timeless fascination?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we enter altered states quite frequently in our normal lives. Sleep is an altered state. Falling in love is an altered state. And as Reggie suggested, I think psychedelics offer a faster and more reliable pathway to those realms. That inherent human curiosity, that drive to understand what lies beyond our normal everyday access, I think that's a powerful motivator.
Right.
Interestingly, there's some evidence suggesting that animals also use psychedelics, so this curiosity and playfulness, this desire to explore beyond our usual boundaries, might not be a uniquely human trait.
And you've actually conducted experiments involving animals and psychedelics, which is something we'll touch on in more detail later.
Yeah.
Rick, what's your perspective? Does it align with what Reggie and Gould have said, or do you see other underlying motivations?
I agree with much of what Reggie and Gould have said, but I'd also emphasize the profound dimension of confronting mortality and seeking meaning in life.
Okay.
Throughout history, psychedelics have been deeply intertwined with spiritual practices. While we often associate indigenous cultures with these uses, it's important to remember that this impulse lies at the very heart of Western culture as well. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, these 2,000-year-old sacred ceremonies, involved a psychedelic potion called kykeon.
Kaikan.
Yeah, kykeon. Revealing the details of the experience was punishable by death, highlighting its profound significance. These rituals were about confronting death and moving beyond our limited sense of self as individuals bounded by birth and death towards a feeling of being part of something much larger. So I believe psychedelics have played a vital role in meaning-making, in helping us find our place within the vastness of the universe. When we talk about the current psychedelic renaissance, a more accurate way to frame it might be as a reemergence after a period of suppression.
Suppression.
Around 392 AD, the Catholic Church essentially dismantled the Eleusinian mysteries and this tradition of direct revelation through psychedelics. Since then, we've seen the persecution of psychedelic practices throughout history, from the burning of witches who utilized various plant medicines to evidence suggesting that early Christians themselves used psychedelics. Yeah. There seems to have been a consistent tendency among power structures to oppose direct religious experience, preferring to act as intermediaries. Now, we find ourselves in a time of immense global challenges, a potentially self-destructive path in our treatment of ourselves, other species, and the environment. This deeper spiritual sense of interconnectedness, which psychedelics can facilitate, could be a key motivator for rewriting our course, both individually and collectively. It's a powerful combination of spirituality, healing, and also celebration and community building.
And we've certainly seen that ebb and flow here in America, haven't we?
Yeah.
The last significant wave of psychedelic research and use was in the 1950s and 60s. Many of us remember, or at least know of, figures like Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, the cultural phenomena of Woodstock, the acid tests, the entire countercultural movement.
Right, the whole thing.
Ultimately, it faced strong suppression, echoing the historical examples you mentioned. Growing up in the 1960s, I vividly recall my mother's warnings. If you ever touch those psychedelic drugs, your mind will fry. You'll have flashbacks for the rest of your life, completely ruining any chance of a normal future. Reggie, did you encounter similar messaging growing up?
Yeah. I mean, I had a kind of loose awareness of it as a kid in Montana during the 70s and 80s. You'd hear whispers and rumors, and maybe in school during anti-drug programs, they'd focus heavily on PCP for some reason. They really didn't want you doing that,
PCP.
even though it wasn't readily available in Montana, so the emphasis was a bit odd. But, there was this general understanding of substances that could make you feel woo. That was the extent of my knowledge. It wasn't really associated with extreme danger, more like stay away from it, or you might think you can fly or something. Clearly misinformation. But when I was 15 or 16 and experienced LSD for the first time, that whole framework shifted dramatically and a lot came into perspective. But yeah, it wasn't so much this is really bad as it was a more generalized, lighter warning to stay away.
Ghoul, what was your experience growing up in Texas during the same era, the 70s and 80s?
Growing up in Texas, then, the war on drugs narrative was very prominent. The "this is your brain on drugs" commercials were everywhere.
Oh yeah, the egg frying.
Exactly. For some reason, in my mind, that messaging seemed more focused on cocaine and heroin as the really scary substances. PCP was another one we heard a lot of alarming stories about. But LSD and magic mushrooms, I had a vague awareness of them, but they didn't carry the same level of fear or urgency in the warnings. I think some of that intense negativity surrounding them had faded somewhat by the time of my childhood.
Now, Rick, you've dedicated a tremendous amount of effort to shifting the societal perspective on psychedelics. What significant changes have you observed in the last decade? And do you feel that the tide in America is indeed turning towards a more positive and understanding view?
Yes, I absolutely feel that the tide has turned. While it's not irreversible, we have a remarkable opportunity to integrate psychedelics responsibly into the mainstream. And this isn't just about recovering from the backlash of 50 years ago, but really from a much longer history of suppression in Western culture, stretching back 1,600 years.
1,600 years?
Yeah. I believe our culture has learned a great deal since the 60s and has integrated many of those lessons. Our approach to death, for example, is far more open now than it was then. Practices like meditation, once considered unusual, are now widely accepted. Even yoga, which used to be viewed with suspicion, is now mainstream. I personally was told that taking LSD 6 or 7 times would lead to certifiable insanity. The significant achievement of the last decade is that rigorous research with MDMA and psilocybin has generated substantial evidence demonstrating both their efficacy and their safety in controlled settings. It's truly remarkable that we're now having serious discussions about these substances as legitimate medicines.
And Rick, your organization, MAPS, is currently conducting Phase 3 clinical trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. That's the crucial final stage before potential FDA approval, which I understand could be a reality within the next couple of years for MDMA.
We are indeed at the forefront, the only group to have initiated Phase 3 trials in this area. We've already completed one successful Phase 3 study. To highlight the significance of this shift, Science magazine, in its annual list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs, recognized MAPS MDMA research for PTSD as one of the leading scientific advancements worldwide last year.
Wow, Science magazine, that's huge.
It is. What has truly changed is that we now have robust data on safety and efficacy from studies approved by the FDA and other regulatory agencies, published in respected, peer-reviewed scientific journals. It's becoming increasingly clear to anyone unbiased and paying attention that in specific, carefully controlled contexts, the potential benefits of psychedelic-assisted therapy can outweigh the risks, particularly for individuals who haven't found relief through existing treatments.
That's truly groundbreaking. So, while their therapeutic application might be the primary avenue for psychedelics to re-enter mainstream society, their capacity to reveal the extraordinary potential of our brains to experience realities far beyond the everyday is another profoundly fascinating aspect, and I must admit, also deeply unsettling. I'd love to hear about your personal experiences, but I'll briefly share one of mine. Years ago, I gave a talk in Amsterdam, and afterwards, my wife and I decided to explore some of the local offerings.
Amsterdam.
I initially took too little, but the following night, I opted for the strongest option, which they jokingly referred to as machine guns, and had the most terrifying night of my life.
Oh, no.
I completely lost my normal sense of time and space, felt utterly disconnected from reality, and ended up asking my wife to tie me to the bed.
Whoa.
It was a powerful, albeit frightening lesson about the diverse states of consciousness our brains are capable of, echoing William James's famous quote about our ordinary waking consciousness being just one specific type, separated by the flimsiest screen from entirely different forms of awareness. Definitely valuable, but also definitely terrifying. Reggie, you mentioned your first LSD experience around the age of 15 or 16. What was that initial encounter like for you?
It was super chill. I didn't really care about it. No, just kidding. It was cool. I mean, I was obviously a little nervous about taking a tab of paper. It's like, oh, this tiny square of paper is going to do something. It didn't really make logical sense. It felt very mysterious. And I took it at a friend's house. We started there. And yeah, I was just hanging out in a room with a friend, and it started coming on. And I just remember when it first began, I was like, woo, woo, because when you haven't had that experience before, it's so amazing to have it revealed to you. It kind of just subtly fades in.
Hmm.
And as it does, there's this sense of disbelief mixed with, oh, I kind of thought this is what it would be like. But of course, I've never felt anything like this at the same time, like a paradoxical realization.
Yeah.
And so that feeling intensified. Then we went outside. We found the top of an apple drink. It's a soda that doesn't exist anymore, but it had a clicky metal top.
Yeah, I know the one you could push on the center and it would go in and out.
Exactly. So when my friends found one on the street and they were just clicking it, click, 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 and then they'd hide and click again. And we were just completely engrossed in this elaborate hide-and-seek game trying to get the clicker from each other. Then we decided to go camping in the middle of the evening, piled into cars, and drove out of town. It's Montana, so it was pretty open. We drove maybe 15 miles and just had to stop on this very empty road. I remember getting out. My friends were doing something by the car, and I wandered to the other side of the road, went into a ditch, and found this reflective orange crossbar, the kind that would be attached to roadwork barriers.
Okay.
I just grabbed this bar, climbed out of the ditch, stood in the middle of the empty road holding it, and thought it was the most hilariously absurd thing in the entire universe. I couldn't stop laughing. I just stood there holding this reflective barrier, laughing my ass off. And so that was basically my first trip.
Wow.
What it exposed was the inherent silliness of the universe, the absurdity of life and consciousness. It was all just hilarious, profoundly funny, and deeply weird. So that was kind of my initial experience.
No, that's a hugely important lesson and a great way to encounter it. Rick, how about you? Do you recall your earliest, first, or most memorable psychedelic experience?
Oh, yeah, I definitely do. But before we get there, I'm curious, what exactly were those machine guns you took? What was the specific substance you did?
I honestly have no idea. And I suspect it was extraordinarily mild because I rarely drink alcohol, I don't smoke anything, and I don't use any foreign substances. So I think my body was so completely unaccustomed to that kind of shift in state that even the most modest dose would have had a significant impact.
Right.
So I don't know the specific substance, but I'm quite sure it was very mild. It's the kind of thing that most people likely wouldn't have that kind of intense reaction to.
Yeah. Was it something you smoked or ingested orally?
Smoked. Okay, actually, might need to ask my wife to be certain, but I believe it was smoked. It's strange that I don't have a clear recollection.
Yeah, I think it is because in the Amsterdam coffee shops, they're legally permitted to sell products containing cannabinoids and also mushroom truffles.
Yeah.
And they're very careful about those regulations.
Like the truffles.
So chances are, if it was smoked, I don't think it was DMT or anything like that, as that doesn't quite match your description because DMT's effects are very rapid and typically over within an hour or less.
Oh, this lasted for many hours.
Yeah, so it sounds like it could have been very potent marijuana or perhaps very strong hash. But the point, I think, for many in the audience listening right now, they might be thinking, wow, he smoked a little weed and had this crazy experience. But so thank you for sharing that. It's really illustrative.
Yeah, exactly. I'm clearly very sensitive.
But what it highlights is that when we discuss psychedelics and therapy, it's really the therapy in combination with the psychedelics that enhances the effectiveness. It's not solely about the substance itself. The context, your mindset, all of those factors are crucial.
Set and setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the aspects you described as frightening the loss of control, the dissolution of the ego, losing that firm sense of who you are, those are often central to the experience. One of my favorite albums from the 60s is David Crosby's solo album, If I Could Only Remember My Name. That title, I think, really captures the feeling of being disconnected from your usual sense of self after taking a significant dose of psychedelics. Gould could elaborate on the neuroscience behind this, perhaps discussing the default mode network. But what happened to me during my very first experience was with LSD when I was 17 years old in college.
Okay.
What initially motivated me to try it was actually a questioning of the prevailing propaganda. I had really believed the warnings that taking it multiple times would lead to insanity and genetic damage. What first made me doubt this was a book I read in my senior year of high school, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, which I loved.
Great book.
A friend told me that Kesey had written parts of it under the influence of LSD. I was initially incredulous, thinking nothing positive could come from LSD, that it was all hallucinations and unreality. But he convinced me to look into it, and he was right. So that whole edifice of fear-based messaging began to crumble for me after learning that. My first experience was challenging, frightening in ways similar to yours, but perhaps less extreme. I felt myself losing my sense of self, and letting go of that control was scary. I was very much in my head at the time, not very emotionally open, and all these difficult feelings began to surface that I struggled to process. It was 1971, and amidst this challenging experience, I also had these glimpses of something deeper, broader, connecting me to something bigger than myself. Yet, a large part of it was this internal battle of having the courage to let go and the fear of doing so. But there were enough positive aspects, a sense of a different way of processing things, that made me feel I should continue exploring it.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. Ghoul, it's fascinating to consider that my experience and the experiences Rick just described all stem from certain atoms arranging themselves into specific molecular forms that then interact with the human body to alter our sense of self and our perception of everyday reality. And I believe we have an image of the LSD molecule we can bring up. Looking at that molecule with its nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen atoms, would you look at that structure and intuitively think it could have such a profound effect on human experience?
Well, I have to say, when I was in college, I designed my own interdisciplinary major. It was a blend of comparative perspectives on the mind, encompassing philosophy, neuroscience, religion, and art.
Wow.
I was initially leaning more towards philosophy, but when I saw this exact picture of the LSD molecule right next to the serotonin molecule, I was absolutely blown away.
The similarity.
Yes, I thought, oh my God, this is the key that will help us unlock all those seemingly intractable problems of consciousness, the nature of reality, all the things that felt like they belonged solely to the realm of philosophy and would never be solved by neuroscience. It truly caused me to radically shift my focus in my first class on drugs, brain, and behavior because of these consciousness-altering properties of a compound that bears such a striking structural similarity to serotonin. To me, that was compelling evidence that all of these complex human experiences, our big emotions, cognitive shifts, our sense of reality, our sense of self, even our feelings about the eternal, ultimately boil down to the interactions of molecules. And I think if you surveyed neuroscientists, you'd find that a significant proportion of them were drawn to the field by a similar realization.
Yeah, Brian, let me just add one quick point, which is that the discovery of serotonin itself was actually partly a consequence of early LSD research.
Oh, interesting.
During the exploration of LSD in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a central question arose. How could such a minute amount, mere micrograms, have such a profound and far-reaching impact on consciousness? This led researchers to theorize that there must be some kind of similar neurotransmitter or signaling molecule present in the brain. And that question really propelled the initial search that eventually led to the discovery of serotonin.
I see. And so this serotonin-like molecule, this LSD molecule, what exactly does it do within the brain? Does it bind to specific locations? I mean, do we understand its action at a fundamental chemical and molecular level?
Yes, LSD, like many other psychoactive compounds, is what we often refer to as dirty drug.
Dirty drug, meaning?
This means it can bind to a wide range of different receptors in the brain, potentially hundreds or even thousands. However, extensive research has indicated that the binding of the LSD molecule to a specific subtype of serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, which is one of 14 known subtypes of serotonin receptors, is particularly significant for its characteristic effects.
Okay, the 2A receptor.
Right. When LSD binds to this receptor, it enters the binding pocket, and then uniquely, it tends to get trapped within it. So instead of triggering the typical relatively short-lived biochemical cascade that occurs when serotonin normally binds to that same receptor, LSD's prolonged presence there initiates a different biochemical cascade, likely due to this extended binding duration. The key takeaway here is that LSD's prolonged grip on this specific receptor leads to a different and more sustained effect than serotonin itself.
I see. So serotonin is this crucial neurotransmitter that facilitates the transmission of electrical signals between neurons. You're saying that LSD, while structurally similar, mimics serotonin, but in a sense binds more persistently to the receptor site than serotonin typically would.
It's not necessarily that it binds more strongly. It just takes significantly longer for the LSD molecule to detach from the receptor.
I understand. And while we'll delve into how that molecular knowledge gives us insights into the subjective effects later, I want to backtrack a bit and move beyond the basic chemical interactions to the realm of the mind, which we've already touched upon through our own experiences. Look, for many of us, our initial introduction to psychedelics and their potential came through Aldous Huxley's seminal book from the 1950s, The Doors of Perception.
Classic.
In it, he vividly recounts his own psychedelic experience. I was actually planning to read one of my favorite excerpts, but Reggie, I think you could do a much better job of embodying the eloquent English philosopher Aldous Huxley. Would you mind reading a short passage for us?
Yes. Uh, yes, I hope I find the part you're referring to now. In a thoughtful, slightly formal tone. To be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception, to be shown for a few timeless hours the outer and inner world, not as they appear to an animal obsessed with survival or to a human being obsessed with words and notions, but as they are apprehended directly and unconditionally by mind at large. This is an experience of inestimable value to everyone, and especially to the intellectual. The only problem is I want you to just read the rest of the book and forego the conversation. But, sure, should I just start at chapter 1 then?
Please, absolutely. Feel free to go right back to the beginning.
Yeah.
But Reggie, when you read that as wonderfully as you just did, what are your immediate thoughts? Is that an accurate assessment of the experience? Is it more of a literary flourish from an articulate writer, or does it ring pretty true to your own understanding?
Well, I think, the essence of the psychedelic experience, this uncovering, is really rooted in paradox, or what I like to call, and I'm sure many others do as well, the paradoxical state.
The paradoxical state.
Once you've experienced that state, the self, non-self, whatever binary you want to apply, and then negate the language that emerges from it, often tries to capture this very dynamic. Wisdom, ideas, insights often arise from contrasting elements that lead to paradoxical conclusions. So the flowery language that dances around this idea of negation, of positive and negative existing simultaneously, while perhaps sounding a bit abstract, is to me trying to deprogram, to defrag the mind from its usual rigid ways of perceiving reality.
So continuing this defragging, there's another passage, if you don't mind, also focusing on perception. It's Huxley's description of a chair as he perceives it under the influence of a psychedelic substance. Would you be willing to read that one for us as well?
Okay, sure. This one's perhaps the most succinct of them all that I've encountered. Reading the legs, for example, of that chair, how miraculous their tubularity, how supernatural their polished smoothness. I spent several minutes, several centuries, not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them, or, to be still more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain sense were they, being my not-self in the not-self, which was the chair.
Amazing. I mean, Rick, does that description resonate with your understanding of the psychedelic experience, that profound shift in perception, that dissolution of boundaries?
It does very strongly. As Reggie was saying, many of those usual boundaries we perceive tend to collapse. It's got a Van Gogh chair depicted there. It certainly evokes the style of a Van Gogh painting.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Yeah. Wow, Van Gogh. Okay. But yes, that description absolutely resonates. And I think that's a key reason why these substances have been used for millennia. They give people this profound sense that we are not isolated entities separate from the environment around us, but rather deeply interconnected parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
The world feels like an intimate part of ourselves, and we feel like an intimate part of the world at this deeper level. And beyond that subjective feeling, there may even be connections to the kind of timeless energies that you could perhaps speak to us about in terms of general relativity or other aspects of modern physics. That energy, for example, isn't destroyed, it's simply transformed.
Right.
I think when people can access that feeling, it can fundamentally shift their attitudes towards death, their appreciation for life, and allow them to live in a more fully engaged way. So while I agree with much of what Aldous Huxley described regarding his mescaline experience, the one point I might differ on slightly is his assertion that it has special value for intellectuals.
Ooh.
In the 1960s, there was significant work done with LSD in treating alcoholism and heroin addiction at institutions like Johns Hopkins and Spring Grove. And Stanislav Grof, who was my mentor and a leading figure in LSD research and the developer of holotropic breathwork, a non-drug method for influencing consciousness in similar ways, often spoke about how individuals on Skid Row struggling with severe alcoholism could still have these profound spiritual experiences under the influence of LSD.
Mm.
They might not have possessed the sophisticated vocabulary that Huxley had to articulate these experiences, but the feeling itself, the transformative impact, was undeniably present. It wasn't contingent on intellectual sophistication. And I think that was one of the tensions during the 1960s, this view held by Huxley and others that psychedelics were perhaps best suited for intellectuals versus the more democratizing view championed by figures like Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary, who felt that access to these experiences should be more widespread.
Now, perception is certainly one thing, and a vital component of the experience, of course. But as you mentioned earlier, many individuals have reported a sense of ego death or ego dissolution. They describe feeling a sense of oneness with the universe, a profound interconnectedness that many suggest reveals a deeper level of reality than what we typically access in our everyday consciousness.
Right, that oneness feeling.
Now, as someone who identifies as a physicalist, a materialist, a reductionist, I'm certainly open to these ideas, but it seems more plausible to me, and I'd be interested in all of your perspectives on this, that these experiences are revealing something profound about our inner world, about the intricate workings of our brains and minds, rather than necessarily revealing something fundamental about the outer world itself. Gul, what are your thoughts on this?
I think this touches upon what William James referred to as the noetic quality of such experiences. The distinct feeling that what you are experiencing under the influence of psychedelics is deeply real, a genuine revelation of truth.
The noetic quality, okay.
I think a mathematician might interpret the same psychedelic experience through the lens of mathematical concepts, like asymptotics. The Good Friday experiment is an interesting example. When researchers gave psilocybin to theology students, many reported profound mystical experiences. Similarly, I imagine if you gave psychedelics to a group of neuroscientists, their interpretation might lean towards the neurochemical mechanisms at play.
Makes sense.
Aldous Huxley himself attempted to explain this mechanistically, proposing that psychedelics essentially opened up what he called the reducing valve of the brain. As a neuroscientist, I always envisioned this as potentially relating to the thalamus, a brain region that acts as a kind of filter for sensory information coming into the brain, allowing only a subset to reach the higher cortical areas.
Like a gatekeeper.
Exactly. I imagined psychedelics were widening this filter, allowing more raw information to flood in. However, current evidence actually suggests that this opening the filter model isn't quite accurate. In fact, if anything, psychedelics seem to increase the influence of what we call priors in neuroscience, your brain's existing assumptions or expectations about how the world works on how you interpret incoming information.
So you're saying more influenced by priors. I would intuitively have thought the opposite, that as these Bayesian probabilistic prediction-making machines constantly trying to guess what's happening in the external world to navigate it effectively, I would have thought that psychedelics would minimize the restrictive view that that probabilistic framework provides,
Yeah.
allowing for a wider range of experience. But you're saying that's not the case.
Well, I think it's important to clarify that what we're discussing in terms of the influence of priors relates specifically to hallucinations, which I don't necessarily equate with the entirety of the psychedelic experience itself.
Okay, good distinction.
I want to make that distinction. Historically, we've talked about classical psychedelics, sometimes more specifically as serotonin psychedelics. And much of this classification is an attempt to understand their mechanisms of action. But figures like Alexander Shulgin, a chemist who did extensive work with MDMA and other psychedelic compounds, defined the term more broadly.
Shulgin.
For Shulgin and many others, psychedelics simply refers to something that produces an altered state of consciousness, regardless of whether or not it induces hallucinations. And of course, people can experience hallucinations for various reasons unrelated to psychedelics, and there are different types of hallucinations. So I don't want to conflate the two. However, studies specifically examining hallucinations do suggest that the opening up the filter idea isn't quite right, and that it's more about this biasing of perception by our existing priors. To give a concrete example, if someone is on a psychedelic and looking at a static photograph of a waterfall, they might be more inclined to perceive movement in the water. This could be an example of how your prior knowledge that waterfalls typically contain flowing water overrides the visual information suggesting a static image.
So the prior, you're saying, triumphs over the other prior, which is that when we look at paintings or photographs on a wall, we generally predict they'll be static.
Yeah.
So you're saying those two priors are competing, and the one focusing on the water's typical movement wins out in that instance.
That tends to be the case, yes.
Gould made a point earlier that if you give psychedelics to a group of priests, they're likely to see God, which I take as an illustration of the widely discussed principle that set and setting is absolutely vital to the psychedelic experience, one's mindset, and the physical environment.
Crucial.
Thinking back, Reggie, have you ever had a challenging or frightening psychedelic experience that you could trace back to a set and setting that wasn't particularly conducive to a more positive or open experience?
Yeah, I think the key word there is safe.
Hmm.
When it comes to psychedelics in general, the feeling of safety, being in a safe environment, being able to relax and not get caught up in those, fear-based, probabilistic projection models, those can very quickly cast a large shadow of gloom over the experience.
Right.
But that's not necessarily always a bad thing, I would say. I've been experimenting quite a bit with ketamine recently, and wow, that is a different kind of psychoactive, psychedelic experience, almost what people call an inwardly psychedelic experience.
I mean,
I definitely had an experience at a dance party recently that wasn't ideal. A friend wanted to try some K, and I usually never do it in that kind of setting. If I do, I prefer to be at home. I have a prescription for it. I lay on a bed. I have high-end surround sound speakers, water nearby, the temperature just right, all these factors to create a comfortable space for the experience.
controlled environment.
Exactly. However, in this instance, my friend had never tried it and wanted to. I thought, well, it's a music festival. Maybe that's a cool place. Who knows? We ended up taking a little too much, and she went out onto the dance floor. Before she did, I said, you might get a little wobbly, so maybe don't go out there. But she went anyway, which was totally fine. She was out there, and then I started to feel it. I was doing a quick press thing backstage, got up, and thought, I better check on her. I went through the curtain, saw all these crazy people dancing, very Halloween-esque vibes, and she was clinging to this long, vinyl, old-school, 70s-style couch that was part of the wall.
Oh, boy.
I sat down next to her, she grabbed onto me, and our friend who wasn't on anything said, yeah, I'm going to get out of here. We were like, why are you leaving right now? So she took off, and it was just the two of us. We got pretty deep into a K-hole, definitely K-hole adjacent or 1 foot in. It was quite intense, and I felt like if I stood up, I'd just fall down. I didn't really understand the mechanics of physics at that point, how I would even pilot my own body. So we just sat there, and it felt like there was this bubble around us. People would come up and say, hey, man, nice show. I had performed that night. Then one guy tried to pitch me on a festival he was organizing and claimed he managed Timothy Leary, which was obviously not true.
Oh, dear.
But he had my ear for a very long time. I had to figure out ways to subtly push people away or tell them, hey, I'm tripping right now. Could you please give me some space? But I was hesitant to say that initially. Anyway, that went on for what felt like a very, very long time. It was like weathering a storm, just hoping the hatch would hold. But at the same time, it was an amazing experience in a strange way because we had to figure out how to navigate it, how to find that moment when I felt confident enough to stand up and she felt confident enough that I felt confident enough and just make it the 15 feet through a curtain. So yeah, that was probably the craziest, darkest trip.
What did you take away from that experience? Did it make you less inclined to try it again later, or did you just add it to the list of experiences in a psychedelic state?
No, I'm not really that kind of person. I have a lot of friends who are like, I had this really bad mushroom trip. I'll never do mushrooms again. It's like, dude, I smoked too much pot once and I can't have it. And I'm always thinking, well, you just didn't try hard enough. Or, there's this kind of extreme guy inside me, like some dude chewing gum leaning against a locker. I don't know who that guy is.
Right.
But generally, when something like that happens, I compare it to my other experiences and really think about the context because that has a huge effect. Usually, I won't give up if I've had really positive results in the past. And with ketamine, I've definitely had amazing results in the past, even from my childhood. We used to also experiment with dextromethorphan, which has a similar dissociative nature, and I find that an interesting space.
DXM, yeah.
So that dance party experience definitely showed me the wrong situation to be in for it, but it doesn't dissuade me from experiencing it again in a more controlled setting.
So, Rick, many researchers have been trying to bridge the gap between the molecular understanding of these chemicals and the subjective effects they produce in us. Could you briefly explain what the default mode network is and the core ideas behind the entropic brain theory, and how these concepts might provide insights into this feeling of ego dissolution, this loss of the usual sense of self under the influence of psychedelics?
Yeah, well, there's a network of brain regions known as the default mode network, which is thought to be closely associated with our sense of self, our internal monologue, and our usual patterns of thought.
Okay, the DMN.
Right. What classic psychedelics tend to do is to temporarily dampen the activity within this default mode network. This leads to a reduced filtering of information, allowing for a much richer, more unfiltered stream of sensory input and internal associations. This can blur the usual distinctions we make between ourselves and the external world, contributing to that feeling of interconnectedness, and sometimes what's referred to as ego dissolution.
Right.
And I think ego dissolution, which you used earlier, is a more accurate term than ego death, because there's still often some observing aspect of the self present, or at least that's one of the fascinating mysteries of the experience.
Yeah.
Gould touched on hallucinations and the influence of priors, and that's relevant here as well.
Mm-hmm.
What we think occurs under psychedelics isn't quite the same as a typical hallucination, where you perceive something that isn't actually there in the external environment. Instead, it seems more like our internal mental landscape being projected onto or blended with our perception of the outside world, and that's where the influence of our pre-existing beliefs and expectations, our priors, comes into play. Just to give you an example, I once worked with someone who had severe PTSD from sexual assault during an MDMA-assisted therapy session. During the experience, she began re-experiencing the original trauma. At times, she would see the face and body of her attacker superimposed on my body, while at other times, she would see me clearly.
Wow.
It was this interplay of her deeply ingrained fear and distrust being overlaid onto her current reality, but also the potential for healing and trust to emerge. As she was able to release the suppressed emotions and anxiety she had to contain during the original incident to survive, she could process the trauma in a new way. The imagery shifted from this frightening blend of me and her attacker to just me, allowing her to find a sense of peace with the memory. So in a way, these altered perceptions can make our underlying priors visible, showing us how we often unconsciously filter and interpret the world through the lens of our fears, anxieties, and beliefs.
Makes sense.
People who are depressed, for example, might constantly overlay the world with expectations of negative outcomes or a lack of trust. Through the therapeutic process facilitated by psychedelics, the stability of how we perceive things can be shaken up, allowing for new perspectives and ultimately a rewiring of those traumatic memories in the brain so they don't trigger the same intense emotional responses.
Mm.
And just one more point on whether these experiences reveal more about our inner world than the outer world. While it's true that at the quantum level we understand we're all interconnected energy with vast amounts of space between particles and we perceive a world of solid, distinct objects, that perception is also a valid way of experiencing the world. I think psychedelics offer us a chance to perceive the world in a different, perhaps equally valid way, giving us insights not just into our own minds, but also potentially into the underlying interconnectedness of reality itself.
Yeah, the only counterpoint I'd offer to that, and I remain open to the idea, is that while quantum mechanics provides this strange description of reality with probability waves and entanglement, it yields testable predictions about the external world that are objectively verifiable by any experimenter, and they all arrive at the same conclusions.
Right, this testability.
That's what gives us confidence that we're truly describing something fundamental about external reality.
Yeah.
In contrast, the experiences we're discussing under psychedelics are often highly subjective and individualized, which at least leads me to lean towards the interpretation that they primarily reveal the intricate workings of our inner mental landscape.
I would just add one thing. From my perspective as an outsider, an amateur observer, a part-time psychonaut warrior person, I would say that, for instance, when I'm improvising music, something I deeply love, whether on stage or just playing, I often enter a state that feels somewhat outside of conventional time.
Extra time.
It's perceived by myself and others playing along as almost having extra time, a buffer where options seem to unfold in the future, and what's being played in the present feels almost like it's already in the past. I don't think there's any way to definitively prove or test this, who knows, but it feels as though you have more creative choices available.
Interesting.
And in music improvisation, you sometimes get this almost psychic effect where someone intuitively knows the next chord change or anticipates a drum fill. You've almost previewed it in your mind, and when it happens, it feels like, yeah, that was exactly what was supposed to happen. And this idea of the paradoxical state I mentioned earlier, the observer and the experiencer, self and non-self, everything and nothing, I think that's key. Interpretation happens within the framework of time, but the raw experience itself often feels indescribable because it exists outside of that linear structure.
Right.
It's like the needle on a record. You can only experience the present moment where the needle is touching the vinyl. What's before or after doesn't exist in that immediate experience. So what I'm trying to say is I feel like when I take psychedelics or other psychotropic substances, it allows my consciousness to flow more freely. In doing so, it reminds me of holographic principles, where things can be interconnected and influence each other across distances.
The holographic universe idea.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if reality is ultimately a kind of holographic, cascading consciousness, infinitely aware of itself. As binary thinking individuals, we tend to seek beginnings, endings, and linear paths, which is perfectly valid for navigating our everyday lives. However, it's quite possible that the deeper nature of reality is both and neither, which can be a bit mind-bending to contemplate.
So, Reggie, are psychedelics, and please forgive my directness, are they a vital part of what enables you to do what you do on stage and in your performances? Are they foundational to your incredible creativity and that remarkable freedom of association you exhibit in improvisational contexts?
I'd say they're definitely helpful in that they've provided me with experiences where I've felt that sense of extra time, as
Mm.
I call it, where I seem to perceive or feel something about to occur just before it happens, or I might turn just as someone's coming around a corner, almost anticipating their arrival.
No.
But perhaps more importantly, putting myself in that kind of headspace, that altered mode of perception, opens me up to a lack of fear of losing control, allowing me to willingly relinquish that control. That's why, as you mentioned earlier, I don't like to be overly prepared for interviews or performances.
Right. The unpreparedness.
The less information I have beforehand, the better. I'd much rather learn and react in real time in that immediate moment. That feels much more interesting and conducive to creative exploration.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful way of engaging with public discussions or performances. Ghoul, your research, we heard Rick describe some of the work being done on the default mode network and the entropic brain theory, but I understand your approach focuses more on neuroplasticity and the concept of critical periods. This, as I recall, ties back to the early work of Konrad Lorenz and extends to your own experiments with mice and psychedelics. Could you walk us through a bit of your research and your perspective on how psychedelics exert their effects within the human brain?
Yes, as you mentioned, our approach looks at a different angle than the default mode network theories. The basic idea is that as the brain matures, we go through specific periods of heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli, times when the brain is particularly malleable and adaptable.
Okay.
During these phases, known as critical periods, the brain readily absorbs information and encodes memories in a very sensitive way. The first well-described example was Konrad Lorenz's work on imprinting behavior in goslings.
Red Goslings.
Right. He showed that if a gosling hatches and sees a moving object other than its mother within a specific critical window, typically the first 24 hours, it will form a lifelong attachment to that object, whether it's an airplane or even Lorenz himself. This attachment becomes as strong as the normal maternal bond. However, if you wait until 48 hours after hatching to introduce the same object, the gosling will not form that lasting attachment.
The window closes.
Exactly. This concept of a critical period exists for many different brain functions. There are critical periods for language acquisition, for motor learning, like learning to ride a bike, for the development of vision and depth perception, and likely for musical ability as well.
Makes sense.
For almost a century since Lorenz's initial discoveries, neuroscientists have been actively seeking ways to reopen these critical periods in the mature brain. The reason for this is that we've developed numerous promising therapies for brain disorders, but they often fail to show significant efficacy in clinical trials. We suspect this may be because by the time we're able to address the underlying issue, the relevant critical period has already closed.
Oh, I see.
If we had a way to reopen these periods of heightened plasticity, we might be able to restore the brain's ability to learn and adapt under the corrected circumstances. A classic example illustrating this is in cases of congenital cataracts. If cataracts are not removed before the closure of the visual critical period in infancy, even if they are surgically removed later in life, the individual will remain permanently blind because the visual system didn't develop properly during that crucial window.
Right.
So the idea is that if we could somehow reopen that visual critical period, then removing the cataracts later might actually restore sight. This has been a major quest in neuroscience for decades, and we haven't really had significant breakthroughs in terms of reliably reopening critical periods.
And so maybe now.
Well, it was incredibly exciting when my lab discovered a novel critical period specifically for social reward learning in mice. We believe this period is crucial for learning the social rules and norms of our society, things like politeness, respecting elders, and understanding appropriate social behaviors. Our groundbreaking finding was that we can actually reopen this social reward learning critical period in adult mice by administering MDMA.
Wow, MDMA specifically.
Yes. This is particularly exciting because it suggests that the seemingly miraculous therapeutic effects of MDMA, which Rick can elaborate on, might be due to this reopening of the critical period. This temporary return to a state of heightened plasticity could then allow for the pairing of this open state with cognitive reappraisal, essentially, revisiting past experiences and memories in a safe and supportive environment, leading to a reorganization and rewriting of those memories. This is our current working hypothesis for how the therapeutic effects of MDMA are achieved.
And so is this something that you believe would translate to humans, even though your current studies have been conducted solely in mice? Is that correct?
Exactly. We believe that what we're doing is a form of reverse translation. The clinical studies that have demonstrated MDMA's effectiveness in treating PTSD, for example, don't just involve taking MDMA and going to a party.
Right, it's therapy assisted.
Instead, the MDMA is administered in conjunction with a specific therapeutic context, a carefully designed set and setting, and intensive psychotherapy. We're trying to understand the fundamental mechanisms by which this combination works, and our animal studies, I believe, are the first to successfully replicate several key aspects of these therapies.
Like what aspects?
One aspect, perhaps less interesting to a general audience but important scientifically, is the dose-response relationship. We've observed a similar dose-dependent effect of MDMA in reopening the social critical period in mice, as has been seen in human studies. Another crucial aspect is the durability of the effects.
The long-lasting relief.
Exactly. One of the remarkable features of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is that the results can be astonishingly long-lasting, with significant relief from symptoms reported even years after the treatment. It's almost as if a fundamental shift has occurred. In our mouse studies, we've also found that MDMA's ability to reopen the social critical period has a rapid onset and surprisingly long durability, extending well beyond the acute subjective effects of the drug lasting up to 2 weeks in mice, which, given the different lifespans, might translate to weeks or even months in humans.
Oh.
And perhaps most importantly, our model has revealed that the effects are context-dependent. If we give MDMA to a mouse and place it in isolation, it doesn't reopen the social critical period.
Okay, so context matters even for mice.
However, if we administer MDMA and then allow the mouse to interact socially within its familiar social group, then we do observe a reopening of this critical period. We believe this dependence on social interaction is specific to reopening a social critical period. It might not be as critical if we were trying to reopen a motor learning critical period, for example.
I don't mean to sound facetious, but I'm genuinely curious. If I were to take MDMA and then sit down at a piano, is it theoretically possible that the critical period for learning the complex motor skills required to play that instrument would reopen for me? Are we talking about that level of potential reopening of critical periods?
Yes, that while not proven at this point, it's definitely one of the exciting directions our lab is currently exploring. We're beginning to see evidence that this phenomenon of critical period reopening might generalize across different psychedelic compounds, not just be limited to MDMA.
Yeah, beyond MDMA too.
And if it's not limited to MDMA, that has huge implications. We initially focused on MDMA because of its well-known acute prosocial effects, the increased feelings of connection and empathy. But the fact that other psychedelics like LSD, which don't necessarily produce the same level of overt prosocial behavior during the acute phase, might also reopen critical periods suggests a more fundamental mechanism at play. Our current thinking is that the altered state of consciousness induced by psychedelics might be indicative of a more general reopening of multiple critical periods. The specific skills or behaviors that are then modified during this window of heightened plasticity would likely depend on the specific context and what the individual is actively engaging with during that time.
So piano practice could potentially benefit.
If this is indeed the case, then the range of conditions that could potentially be treated with psychedelics expands dramatically, far beyond just mental health disorders. We're already investigating possibilities in areas like stroke rehabilitation and motor learning, where critical periods are known to play a significant role. So yes, the potential for reopening critical periods relevant to language learning, learning to ride a bicycle, or learning to play the piano are all within the realm of possibility, although still very much in the realm of hypothesis at this stage.
Now, Brian, I just want to add that if you were to take MDMA, let's say, and instead of sitting at a piano, you were in a therapeutic setting, lying down in a comfortable space, I think there's a good chance that you might recall your experience in Amsterdam when you took whatever it was and felt scared and wanted to be tied to the bed.
Revisiting that.
These kind of profound and challenging memories from the past can often surface in a different way under the influence of MDMA in a therapeutic context, allowing you to look at them from a new perspective and potentially process them in a way that leads to healing. You mentioned the reproducibility of quantum physics experiments versus the subjectivity of psychedelic experiences.
Hmm.
But I would argue that the durability of the therapeutic outcomes we're seeing in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is a form of objective evidence.
The lasting change as evident.
People revisit deeply ingrained trauma, reprocess it in a supportive environment, and their lives change in significant and lasting ways. For example, individuals with PTSD, who often experience constant hypervigilance and fear, can find lasting relief and a different way of relating to the world. So while the immediate experience is subjective, the lasting changes in behavior and well-being offer a tangible, repeatable outcome.
Wow. So, Reggie, do these descriptions of heightened malleability and potential for rewiring resonate with your own anecdotal experiences? Do you find that under the influence of psychedelics, you sometimes, or perhaps reliably, feel connected to a younger, more adaptable, more open version of yourself? Is that part of how you would describe the experience?
I think so. There's a sense of accessing what I might call the timeless self, that core awareness that has been on the journey of consciousness the whole
The
time.
timeless self.
I see that more as an internal connection, not necessarily in a mystical or afterlife sense, but more like tapping into the fundamental awareness of self. From the very beginning of consciousness, it feels like connecting to that core essence, a kind of self-self, or maybe even self-non-self, something very familiar. It's reminiscent of an experience I had in the Arboretum in Seattle in the 90s. A friend identified some blue ringers, mushrooms growing naturally, and we ate them straight from the ground.
Fresh off the ground. Wow.
Yeah. It was one of the most profound experiences of my life. I remember going into the public restroom there, sitting down on the toilet seat, and just putting my head in my hands in the terrible lighting. I then kind of left and went on this huge, massive, hyperfractal journey, like cruising through some internal tunnel. Eventually, I arrived at this quiet place where it felt like I met myself, what some might call God, but I experienced as a kind of self-non-self.
Hmm.
There was this profound feeling of reunion, like, oh, I haven't seen you in a long time, and this gentle voice seemed to say, yeah, you really need to stop being so hard on yourself.
Yeah.
It was this beautiful moment of connecting with that familiar core self that feels distinct from the self that accumulates experiences through active engagement in life.
So, talking about the dualist versus non-dualist view of the world, I gather, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't really separate your experiences into non-psychedelic and psychedelic. Do you see it all as part of one continuous human experience that's simply modulated by whether or not you've taken a psychedelic, but it all ultimately blends into who you are?
Absolutely, 100%. I believe that these states of awareness, these different perspectives are always present. All angles of perception exist at any given moment. It just depends on what you happen to notice, whether that shift in awareness is triggered by a chemical substance, a near-death experience, or even just intense fascination with something.
Right.
I believe the underlying intersection of all these experiences is the same. It's just a matter of which angle you approach it from. It's like I have this terrible joke about a statue in a museum that represents racism. There's a large circular bench around it, and all kinds of people are sitting there looking at the statue, but they all have a slightly different perspective. Some of those people are racist, some are not, and some are somewhere in between. But ultimately, it takes everyone to make racism function.
Interesting analogy.
So whatever object or experience someone encounters, there are countless ways to look at it and interpret it. That's terrible. That's actually really cool. That's not so bad. That's terrible, but in a good way, whatever it might be. I find that the specific label doesn't ultimately matter. I think psychotropic psychedelics put you in a mental state that's much more open to this flexibility of perspective, much more malleable when it comes to established beliefs, as opposed to the more analytical approaches of our two guests who study the actual mechanisms behind why we are who we are and why things function the way they do.
Reggie, what you just said reminds me of how Sasha Shulgin, the pioneering psychopharmacologist, would approach the creation and understanding of new psychoactive drugs. He would synthesize a new compound. He and his wife Anne would try it themselves, but then they would also share it with a trusted group of about 12 individuals they had worked with for decades.
The Children Group.
Each of these 12 people would invariably have slightly different experiences, just as you described, because they were approaching it from their own unique perspectives. Only after gathering these diverse individual reports would they form a more complete picture of the drug's effects and consider its potential for therapeutic use. It really took that kind of communal exploration to gain a fuller understanding. I love that connection.
And so to any or all of you, Reggie, you brought up the issue of racism and viewing a statue from many different angles. Do you think psychedelics offer a potential pathway to addressing some of the deeply entrenched social ills of our world?
Well, I believe they can contribute, but I would again emphasize that culture and context are more significant than the experience itself.
All right, context again.
Consider the ayahuasca churches that originated in Brazil and have since spread to the United States. While the Supreme Court has recognized the use of ayahuasca as legally protected for these particular religious groups, these are syncretic religions that have, in some cases, adapted to accommodate aspects of the Catholic Church, leading to the perpetuation of problematic social structures like homophobia, patriarchy, and hierarchy.
Mm.
So even though individuals within these ceremonies may frequently experience ego-dissolving states of interconnectedness, when they return to their everyday lives and interpret those experiences through the lens of their cultural context, those pre-existing biases can unfortunately persist. I believe that psychedelics used within a more open and intentionally designed framework can indeed serve as an antidote to issues like racism, genocide, and environmental destruction. However, it's too simplistic to think that the psychedelic substance alone will magically solve these complex problems. It's the combination of the psychedelic experience, the surrounding context, and, as Ghoul mentioned, the extended period of neuroplasticity afterwards, and how individuals integrate those experiences into their lives that holds the real potential for positive change. I think we desperately need new approaches to move beyond the us versus them mentality that fuels so many of our social ills, and I believe that psychedelics, used wisely and with adequate support, can indeed be a significant part of the solution.
Building on that point, Rick, you mentioned earlier the MDMA-assisted therapy studies, and I believe one you're involved with is now in phase 3 clinical trials with some remarkably positive results. While I don't have the specific data in front of me, I recall that a significant percentage of patients who received this combined treatment experienced profound relief from their symptoms.
That's correct.
And we have this incredibly compelling and insightful testimonial that I'd like to play now to get all of your reactions to it. So let's take a listen to this. Saro Jaramillo, audio clip. My name is Saro Jaramillo. By day, I'm a police lieutenant with the Winthrop, Massachusetts Police Department and a psychotherapist at night. People might be shocked that a police officer is advocating for psychedelics, but I believe we're in the middle of a mental health crisis across the whole country. I want to bring psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to the police, because in policing, PTSD is a big problem. There's a lot of uncertainty with this type of work. You don't know what kind of a call is going to come in. Anytime an officer is waking up to go to work, their nervous system's activating in a really distinct kind of way. You're not going in calm, you're tensed up, you're jacked up a little bit, you have a little bit of cortisol and adrenaline going through your bloodstream, and that's a daily occurrence. Over time, over the course of an entire career, it can cause problems. We're seeing the rapid escalation of death by suicide in officers, the numbers related to depression, the numbers related to suicidality, anxiety, they're staggering. Your past and your training and experience go into the way that you act on the street. Trauma tends to narrow people's perspective. Trauma taps into fundamental fear responses. It creates an ES and them perspective. We're in a point in history right now where that needs to change. It's really important for us to not have a knee on the throat of a civilian. We need to get together. We need to take walls down. And I think that medications like MDMA will be able to help with that because it'll temper down that fear response. It'll bring in new perspective or wide perspective to allow for ideas around being one group, one family. My MDMA experience was federally sanctioned, a part of a research protocol. When medicine took effect, I had this deep, overwhelming sense of love come across me. But what happened right after that sense of love was a sense of gratitude. And it gave me the needed perspective as to how MDMA is going to help somebody that's struggling with treatment-resistant severe PTSD. Our officers will make decisions better if they are rested, if they're well, if their resiliency is at the highest capacity. I care about helping with that because I'm helping not only the officers, but that person that intersects with them in that moment where that decision might have to be made, and maybe the best possible decision will be made. We're on a precipice of a sea change in the way we help people. We need to destigmatize access. We need to speed up access. We need to get enough therapists trained because when used carefully, cautiously, with care and guidance under certain protocols, I think these medicines can be very, very effective and helpful in people dealing with their suffering. So that's a pretty significant statement, right? A police lieutenant openly advocating for the use of what is currently classified as a Schedule I substance. What are your initial reactions to what you just heard?
I think it's absolutely tremendous. I attended the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference years ago, hoping to connect with someone like Saro, and we did indeed meet him there. His articulation of the us and them dynamic is so powerful.
Yeah.
For me, given my history with the drug war, I've often felt like the police were the predators and I was the prey, making it challenging to develop empathy. But I've come to understand the incredibly difficult job they have, and without the drug war, there wouldn't be this same sense of division, I believe.
Hmm.
Police officers themselves experience a great deal of alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, and, tragically, suicide, as Sorrow mentioned. What I hadn't fully appreciated is the prevalence of veterans within police forces, creating a cycle of trauma. Individuals who may have experienced trauma early in life, perhaps contributing to their decision to join the military, then experience further trauma in service, and upon returning, enter law enforcement where they can be further traumatized.
That cycle.
So I see Sarah's willingness to explore MDMA as coming from a place of genuine desperation within the police community, a recognition of the urgent need for new approaches. These aren't just substances for the counterculture of the 60s. These are potentially powerful tools that can and should be mainstreamed, impacting many aspects of our society. I believe Sorrow is uniquely positioned as a police officer and a psychotherapist to speak to his own personal experience and how he envisions MDMA-assisted therapy helping his fellow officers. It's truly inspirational to witness.
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I personally believe that many of the societal issues we face ultimately boil down to awareness, or rather a lack thereof. And with police, I have friends who are officers, and they often talk about the relatively limited amount of training they receive.
Yeah.
So it's often a very short initial period, followed by being thrust into incredibly challenging situations, a kind of trial by fire. That in itself speaks to an awareness issue. So it's not surprising to hear about the various problems that exist within police forces in our country. I think anything that leads to more comprehensive training, including more psychological support, would be a positive step, equipping officers with the tools they need to handle difficult situations, both practically and psychologically.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier with the concept of extra time, that's essentially what you'd want in those high-pressure, split-second decision moments that can drastically alter lives, a sense of having the training and mental clarity to make the best possible choice. So, I wholeheartedly agree with Sorrow's point about potentially leading to better decision-making. I think improved training, including robust psychological support throughout their careers, is absolutely vital. We want the most capable and well-trained individuals in these crucial roles. While the political and bureaucratic complexities will always exist, the people on the ground making these critical decisions deserve the best possible preparation and ongoing support. So, yes, I'm all for it.
And so, Gould, do you see this as a potential direction for the future? And how does any of this relate to the research you're conducting in your lab?
Yes. I think both Rick and Reggie have touched on crucial aspects. Again, I don't believe these drugs are a magic bullet solution. If you were to administer a drug like MDMA and then simply reinforce existing us versus them attitudes, fostering bonding only within the police force while maintaining a divisive view of the community they serve, it could potentially be very dangerous.
A potential misuse.
The key will be to integrate these therapies in a way that cultivates genuine empathy for those previously considered the other. The context of the therapy, the set and setting, will be absolutely critical in facilitating that cognitive reappraisal and transformation that I believe is necessary for these treatments to have the desired positive impact on social dynamics.
Right.
And I do think that a deeper understanding of the underlying mechanisms, while perhaps sounding like a scientific digression, will be an important component of this. It wouldn't be wise, for example, to take a police officer who routinely faces stressful and difficult situations and immediately return them to active duty just a day or two after a profound MDMA experience.
The reintegration period?
Our research in mice suggests that they, and likely humans as well, remain in a more sensitive, vulnerable, almost childlike state for a period of weeks after MDMA administration due to that open critical period. Just as you wouldn't expose a young child to intense or traumatic situations immediately, it's crucial to understand the timeline of these effects and allow for a period of reintegration and for that heightened plasticity to return to a more stable state before putting individuals back into high-stress environments. Otherwise, you risk unintended consequences.
Rick, we began our conversation by discussing how the tide is turning, or perhaps has already turned, in terms of how the world, and specifically governmental agencies, are viewing psychedelics, allowing for increased research and the potential for rescheduling some of these substances. But is there also a risk, and I think you alluded to this earlier, that if things don't progress at the right pace and in the right way, that society might not be ready to fully integrate these changes, and we could potentially see a return to a time when all of these substances are simply outlawed again?
Well, I think there's always that inherent risk of a backlash. Look at the current fragility of democracy itself. Who would have thought that would be a serious concern in our time?
True.
We grew up with a sense that democracy was so deeply ingrained in the fabric of America, from the Revolution to the Civil War. Now we see it as quite fragile and potentially at risk. So yes, I believe the possibility of a backlash against psychedelic progress always exists. That's why I believe it's so crucial to pace social change thoughtfully and engage in comprehensive public education.
Education is key.
We need to help people understand the nuances and move away from the simplistic good drugs versus bad drugs mentality that has fueled the drug war for so long. There are no inherently good or bad substances. It's about our relationship with them and whether that relationship is productive or harmful. However, I do believe that our culture has learned valuable lessons in the 50 years since the last major backlash against psychedelics, and the current global mental health crisis, along with the other significant challenges we face, might create a greater openness to exploring new solutions.
Perhaps so.
So, I'm optimistic that we can continue to make progress towards mainstreaming psychedelic psychotherapy and ultimately reforming drug policy, perhaps even to the point where experiences like your Amsterdam adventure might be more easily and safely navigated. But we must proceed cautiously. I believe the two most important things are to avoid overstating the benefits while also not understating the risks.
Balance.
These were mistakes made both by the government in its fear-mongering in the past and by some psychedelic advocates who perhaps minimize the potential downsides. A balanced perspective, grounded in scientific evidence and coupled with robust public education, is essential for ensuring a safe and sustainable integration of psychedelics into our society.
Yes, that would certainly be the ideal path forward. Ghoul, I want to circle back to a comment you made earlier. You mentioned that part of your initial motivation for entering this field of research was to try and understand the fundamental nature of consciousness, really get a handle on what it is that gives rise to this inner world of experience in the first place. That really resonates with me because my own pursuit of physics stems from a desire to understand the deepest workings of the universe, a belief that through that understanding, I gain a certain profound connection to the cosmos. It might sound a bit lofty, but I genuinely feel a link to the wider world when I grasp its underlying principles. Do you believe that psychedelic research will ultimately provide significant insights into this inner world of conscious experience?
I do believe so, and I actually have some unpublished data that hints at this, although I don't want to go into too much detail. We've touched a couple of times on the concept of mystical experiences and the fact that some individuals can access these states without the use of psychedelics.
Right. Meditation, breath work.
In various mystical and religious traditions, practices like sensory deprivation, silent retreats, or social deprivation, such as living in monasteries, or as hermits are used to achieve these altered states. Rick also mentioned holotropic breath work, another non-pharmacological method for inducing similar experiences. It might seem unlikely that we could ever understand the neurobiological basis of these profound states by studying mice.
Seems like a stretch, yeah.
However, we've found that social deprivation in mice can also lead to a reopening of the social critical period. And we know from research on the visual system that visual deprivation can reopen the visual critical period. This overlap between the methods used in mystical traditions and the effects of psychedelics converging at the level of critical periods is incredibly exciting to me.
Wow, a potential convergence point.
It suggests a potential mechanistic link that we can start to investigate. If this holds true, it could provide us with a tangible way to begin exploring the neurobiological underpinnings of those big questions. Consciousness, the nature of self versus other, our understanding of what happens after death, questions that, honestly, I didn't think we'd have a scientific handle on within my lifetime. But suddenly I'm feeling rather optimistic about this as a potential avenue for understanding them.
Well, that would be an astounding and truly remarkable outcome if that's where this research ultimately leads. Reggie, one final, perhaps unusual request. As we begin to wrap up our conversation, we've discussed the vital importance of set and setting for a positive psychedelic experience. So imagine that I do, at some point in the future, muster the courage to embark on another psychedelic journey. I'm wondering if you would be willing to improvise a short musical piece that would serve as a kind of sonic launch pad for that experience, taking me to wherever you think might be a good place to go.
Oh, a psychedelic song. I guess. Gosh, that'd be, well, I mean, if the question, I don't have my guitar here. I would say, I would. I think I got it. Maybe this might help. Hold on, I have to close my eyes to do this because if I'm looking at things I can't do. Okay, here we go. Here it is. And 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Here we go. We're almost ready. Just systems are booting up online, reinitializing. Yes. Okay, and here, no, okay, here it is. Okay, no, okay, hold on. Okay, hey, that's it. Hey, don't you forget what you did. No, because you did it so many times before. If you are fearful, then don't worry, child, because there's a bright new future. Sail away on a magic carpet. Say hello to some friends. Go to somebody's house and maybe get them to go to the gym. And if you want some Raisinets, you find them in a store. Don't worry, baby. Mescaline galore, acid galore, ketamine galore, MDMA or MDA, all of the things that TCPs, the 2C, and all the things that make you just psychedelics, you'll love it or your money back.
It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for that. And I'll be sure to report back to you and let you know where that sonic journey takes me at some point in the future. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this truly fascinating conversation about psychedelics. And best of luck to Reggie with your upcoming performances, and to Ghoul and Rick with your vital and groundbreaking work in this area of science and the mind. Thank you all so much.